Welcome to Boring History Podcast. This time we're talking about what it might have been like to live in the medieval world.
You've made it to a quiet little corner of the internet. I'm really glad you're here.
Take a slow, gentle breath and let your eyes start to soften.
There's nothing you need to do right now. Nothing to fix, nothing to chase.
This moment is just for you.
You are safe here, exactly as you are.
Let the world outside fade away for a while.
Let your mind float freely as we quietly wander through the past together, like pages turning in a book you don't need to finish.
And if this feels like a nice place to rest, you're welcome to like and subscribe, only if it feels right in your heart.
And if you're still awake, I'd love to know what time it is for you and where in the world you're listening from.
I think that's a beautiful thing to share. Hygiene, filth, and disease. Okay, so we're going to step back in time now. And the first thing you'll probably notice, quite vividly as well, it's an almost overwhelming presence.
Not sight, but something else.
Exactly. It's the sheer, unyielding smell of medieval life. It's truly unlike anything we could possibly experience today, just this persistent, heavy atmosphere you can almost, feel in the air.
Right. Imagine, if you can, a world utterly devoid of modern plumbing, of the clean water systems we just take for granted every single day.
Completely absent.
So picture a bustling medieval town, right? Vibrant with people, activity, markets. But instead of paved streets and drains, you're walking through, a constant unpleasant flow of everything.
Yeah, that everything. It wasn't hidden away, was it? Garbage, animal carcasses, all kinds of human waste.
Nope. Openly, regularly dumped. Right into the very streets you'd walk on.
Or into ditches alongside the road.
Yeah, or even, maybe most disturbingly, straight into the rivers. The same rivers people relied on for drinking, for washing, for, everything.
So that pervasive scent of decay and human effluvia, it would have been the background noise, the background smell to every single moment.
Absolutely. The streets themselves weren't just dirty paths. They're often literally open sewers. You'd see horse dung everywhere, of course, that's expected.
Right.
But also the contents of slop pails and, that means chamber pots full of human waste.
Just flung from upstairs windows.
Just flung, splashing down onto the ground below. And occasionally, maybe amidst all that muck, you might even step over a rotting corpse. Maybe an animal? Maybe. Right, well.
Wow. It paints a truly visceral picture of the ground beneath your feet. Something you'd be constantly acutely aware of.
You'd have to be. And even inside the homes, things weren't much better. Dirt floors were incredibly common.
Packed earth, basically.
Packed earth. And often, they were covered with straw. Now, that sounds kind of cozy, doesn't it? A bit rustic, maybe warm.
I might think so, initially.
But this straw wasn't changed often. Not like we'd change bedding. It could be reused for years, literally becoming a layered, foul mess of spills, food scraps, dirt, mud tracked in, animal droppings.
Yeah.
Just building up over time.
So it wasn't just a surface layer, it became deeply embedded, part of the house itself, like a compost heap you lived on.
Exactly. The renowned scholar, Erasmus, writing about his experiences in that very time, vividly described chapel floors, holy places, layered with 20-year-old vomit mixed with beer spills and other abominations not fit to be mentioned. He actually wrote that.
20 years in a chapel.
20 years. It wasn't just a transient mess. It was an accumulation, a historical record of filth, literally woven into the fabric of the buildings people revered.
That's staggering. And with all that omnipresent waste, well, it must have been a paradise for vermin.
Oh, absolutely. Rats, mice, flies. They absolutely thrived in these conditions. Their populations just exploded.
The fleas carried by those rats.
They were the terrifying, unseen vectors for the bubonic plague, swarming every mattress, every pile of straw, every hut, especially in the warm, humid summer months.
An unseen, crawling army, present everywhere. A constant, low-level irritation that carried this immense, deadly threat.
And it wasn't just the plague. There are even historical accounts that are just truly unsettling in their starkness.
Like what?
Take the year 1184, for instance. There was this large gathering of nobles, church officials, in church in Erfurt.
Okay.
And the upper floor they were meeting on, actually collapsed under their weight.
Oh, no.
And dozens of them plummeted into the latrine pit below, the cellar, basically, which was the communal toilet.
Drowning
In liquid excrement or suffocating in the horrifying stench. It gives you this immediate physical sense of the danger inherent in simply existing. A terrifying, visceral incident that just underscores the constant peril.
So, okay, we have this environment of pervasive filth just inescapable. But what about the people themselves? Personal hygiene.
Daily life meant being inherently smelly and grimy.
Yeah.
Regular full-body bathing, as we understand it today, incredibly rare.
Why? Just lack of desire.
Not necessarily. It's a profound logistical challenge. Think about heating enough water for a bath without modern plumbing or readily available fuel.
Right. Huge amounts of firewood, hours of work.
Exactly. So most people would perform what they call top and tail washing.
Top and tail?
Yeah, just a quick splash of water on the face, hands, maybe private parts, in a small basin. Probably once a day, if that. A full body bath in a tub or maybe a river in summer. Very uncommon.
Okay, so what about public bathhouses? Did those exist? Did they help?
They did exist, yes. But ironically, they actually had a notorious reputation for spreading disease.
Oh, not places of cleansing then.
Not really. Think about it. Lots of people. Warm water, shared space.
Yeah.
Perfect breeding ground. Medieval doctors even specifically warned the wealthy to avoid them during epidemics. They recognized them as dangerous communal spaces.
Wow. So even trying to get clean could make you sick.
Precisely. And for peasants, when they did bathe, which was rare, it was often in cold river water, and they rarely had soap.
Soap was a luxury.
Very much so. And those rivers and streams, the very sources of water, also commonly used as toilets. People routinely urinated or defecated directly into them or just emptied their chamber pots right there.
So the limited sources of potentially clean water were continuously openly polluted. It just compounds the problem.
Absolutely. Because of all this, pretty much everyone, from the lowliest peasant laboring in the fields to the richest lord residing in his drafty castle, they simply smelled bad.
A universal condition.
Pretty much. Their bodies were largely unwashed, their teeth untreated and often decaying, and their clothing. Well, you might only have one or two changes of clothes for an entire season.
Just worn over and over.
Ragged, patched, reworn. That unique, pervasive odor of unwashed bodies and stale clothing would have been a constant, inescapable presence for everyone.
And the bugs. You mentioned fleas, but other bugs too.
Oh, the bugs, yes. Human lice, head lice, body lice, and fleas-infested hair. Beards, bodies, bedding constantly.
Even royalty. You think they could avoid that?
Not immune at all. Chronicler explicitly noted that King Henry IV was visibly crawling with lice at his own coronation in 1399.
At his coronation.
While being crowned. So even as the crown jewels gleamed, the monarch himself was host to this tiny, persistent ecosystem.
That's quite an image. Have archaeologists confirmed this?
Oh yes. Through examining historical remains, they've confirmed that medieval people consistently harbored head lice, pubic lice, and various intestinal worms.
Intestinal worms too. Ugh.
Yes. King Richard III's bones, for instance, contained roundworm eggs. And 15th century King Ferdinand II, his remains, showed evidence of head and pubic lice.
It truly is hard to imagine living with that constant, pervasive layer of crawling, biting bugs on your scalp, in your clothes, on your body. A persistent, profound discomfort that never truly went away.
It must have been maddening. And this overall environment, this lack of sanitation and hygiene, it was an absolute breeding ground for common parasites and diseases.
Right. Without flush toilets or clean, accessible water, these insidious parasites absolutely thrived, moving freely between people, animals, their living spaces.
Every surface, every interaction carried an inherent, invisible risk.
And the cesspits you mentioned, they found evidence.
Oh, yes. Excavated cesspits from medieval towns are a grim but incredibly informative historical record. They're literally filled with evidence of tapeworm, roundworm, and hookworm eggs.
So what did that mean for people's health?
It meant townsfolk suffered from constant dysentery and diarrhea, chronic conditions stemming directly from contaminated food and water. This wasn't just an occasional upset stomach. It was a debilitating daily battle for basic health and well-being, eroding their strength and vitality.
And finding things in their food.
They even routinely found worms in stored grains, rats scurrying through food piles, or maggots wriggling in their stew.
Oh.
Typhoid and cholera-like outbreaks, often just generically referred to as dysentery back then, were routine and devastating epidemics. The very food meant for sustenance could be a vector for immediate and severe illness, nourishment turning into a threat.
You mentioned lice and fleas carrying disease.
Right. Lice spread typhus, fleas carried the deadly plague, and dead animals were a common, often ignored sight. Rats or dogs would sometimes fall into wells and just rot there.
Directly contaminating the water source for the whole community.
Directly. The threat was literally bubbling up from the ground, from the very liquid they relied on for survival.
So because of these ever-present dangers from water, any unboiled water was considered a huge sickness risk, almost a guarantee of getting sick.
Pretty much. To avoid it, most people, even children, drank weak beer or ale all day long. They thought it was safer.
Safer than water.
They believed so. But of course, even that could spoil or harbor bacteria, especially if brewing conditions weren't clean. So it was often a choice between immediate, obvious danger from the water and a slightly less obvious, but still present, risk from the drink.
It's a very visceral picture, isn't it? The air itself must have felt heavy with illness, not just the odors from the streets and bodies. It really paints a detailed picture of constant low-level anxiety about your very existence.
Just breathing that air or taking a sip of water, it felt like a gamble with unseen threats every single time.
And then if you did get sick, which sounds almost inevitable...
Right. If you got sick, the so-called cures were often more horrifying and painful than the illness itself. Medieval medical treatments were truly grotesque, an alarming blend of rudimentary understanding, ancient theories, and desperate superstition.
The attempts to heal often mirrored the suffering of the malady itself, didn't they?
They really did. Doctors, such as they were, relied heavily on ancient concepts like balancing the four humors within the body: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile.
The humoral theory, right.
And this often meant practices like bloodletting, either by directly cutting veins or applying leeches.
Leeches? Ugh.
They would literally drain pints of your blood, believing they were removing an excess humor, potentially bleeding you to death, all in an attempt to rebalance these internal fluids. It was a method based on faulty theory and could be incredibly dangerous, often counterproductive.
What else did they do, based on humors?
Well, they'd also meticulously examine your urine, its color, its smell, how it settled in a flask, believing it revealed your internal state, your humoral imbalance.
Urine diagnosis.
Very common. Uroscopy, they called it. Then, based on these observations, they dose you with harsh laxatives or emetic substances to make you vomit violently or apply poultices made of, well, who knows what, herbs, animal dung, bread mold, truly unknown ingredients.
Imagine relying on a doctor who could tell your fate from your urine, only to then give you a concoction of dung.
It's quite something. And then there was surgery. Surgery in the medieval world was pure, unadulterated torture.
Because of the lack of anesthetic?
Primarily, yes, but also the lack of hygiene. Barber surgeons, they weren't educated physicians, often literally barbers or butchers who also did surgical procedures.
You're right, they had the sharp tools.
Exactly. They would perform procedures like amputations or draining abscesses with absolutely no anesthetic and zero concept of cleanliness. They often used unsterilized knives, moving from one patient to the next without a thought for infection.
The sheer horror of that moment, the raw, unimaginable pain, it's almost impossible to truly grasp.
Absolutely. And if you broke a bone, it might be crudely reset with rough rope or splints. Compound fractures where the bone pierced the skin almost always became infected. Gangrene.
So a simple accident, a fall, could quickly turn fatal, or at best, leave you crippled for life. Even a scraped knee could become a death sentence in that world.
It could. For war wounds, which often left bone exposed to infection, the situation was even more dire. If a limb was mangled beyond repair, a surgeon might just saw it off, with the patient screaming in agony.
How fast could they do it?
Amputations were performed incredibly quickly, often in under a minute, as fast as humanly possible. But not for precision. It was purely to limit the agonizing suffering of the patient, a race against the clock and the patient's unbearable pain.
But survival rates must have been abysmal.
Abysmal. People routinely bled out on the table or died of shock, or most commonly died of infection days or weeks later. It was an almost certain outcome for any major intervention. The act of seeking treatment was almost as dangerous as the illness or injury itself.
The concept of a successful surgery, as we understand it, just didn't exist in a meaningful way then.
Not really. And teeth. We mentioned teeth briefly. Nobody had dentistry as we know it.
What did they do for toothache?
People might try using chewing sticks or rubbing their teeth with rough cloths, maybe some herbs. But plaque and decay ran rampant. A simple toothache often meant an abscess formed.
Which could spread.
Exactly. It could spread to the jaw or even into the brain, leading to agonizing pain and eventual death. The discomfort of constant tooth pain leading to such a grave outcome is truly sobering.
So lots of people lost their teeth.
Many adults had half-rotted teeth or lost them completely due to decay and infection. Oral hygiene was minimal, and without antibiotics, even minor cavities could become fatal infections. It makes you truly appreciate how life-saving a simple trip to the dentist or a course of antibiotics really is today.
Yeah, no kidding. And you mentioned maggots earlier.
Everywhere you looked, there were maggots and insects. Flies buzzed around every scrap of meat, every pile of open garbage, laying their eggs in food, and, disturbingly, in open wounds on humans and animals.
And open wounds. Oh, that's horrific.
It wasn't an occasional nuisance. It was a constant moving, buzzing presence, a visible part of the fabric of daily life. Bedbugs infested straw bedding, a constant source of itching and irritation. Water bugs infested wells, hinting at the contamination below the surface.
There was simply no escaping the crawling, buzzing life forms. They were an inherent, persistent part of medieval living. They weren't just in the environment, they were part of the environment you endured.
It's striking, isn't it, how vulnerable life was then? Every breath felt like a gamble with unseen threats, and every physical symptom could signal something far more sinister than we'd ever imagined today.
Absolutely. And the idea of that constant itching, the feeling of bugs crawling on you, always present. It makes you truly realize how many layers of comfort and fundamental cleanliness we just assume today without a second thought. It's a very different baseline for daily existence.
You can almost feel the grit and the grime just by thinking about it. That pervasive, quiet discomfort that was simply the background hum of existence. The low-level noise of their physical world.
The sheer resilience they must have had just to endure that level of constant discomfort and threat, day after day, generation after generation. It feels immense, a quality we perhaps can't fully comprehend from our modern vantage point. #22. Food, water, and starvation.
Okay, so let's gently turn our attention now to something even more fundamental. What people ate, what they drank, and the ever-present shadow that loomed over every single meal.
Right, because survival wasn't just about avoiding disease, it was about getting enough to eat in the first place. And that sounds like it was a struggle.
A profound struggle. For the vast majority of people in the medieval world, daily life revolved around coarse bread, a bland pottage, and the relentless gnawing threat of near starvation.
Right.
It wasn't about culinary delight. It was about basic caloric intake, a monotonous existence deeply intertwined with the fickle fortunes of the harvest.
So what was this pottage?
It was typically a bland gruel or porridge, often made from the cheapest grains available, like barley, oats, or maybe rye. Whatever vegetables were cheap and available, onions, beans, turnips, cabbage, would be thrown in to thicken it.
Simple, hearty maybe, but utterly uninspiring and unchanging day after day.
Exactly. Peasants rarely, if ever, saw meat. Perhaps on a very special feast day, maybe Christmas or Easter, or if they managed to secretly catch a small rabbit while poaching on the Lord's land, which was risky.
Right. Hunting rights belonged to the nobility.
Precisely. Otherwise, their sustenance was mostly coarse bread, often dark bread made from rye or barley, and weak beer. Meat was a true luxury, a potent symbol of extreme privilege and distance from that daily grind.
But the nobles, they ate well.
Oh, the nobles lived a dramatically different culinary reality. Their tables groaned under the weight of roast meats, beef, pork, venison. Exotic game birds like peacock and swan were delicacies. Elaborate pies, rich cheeses, imported spices, fine wines.
That's amazing. But you mentioned dangers even for them.
Yes, even their abundance didn't guarantee safety from spoiled food or from the effects of overconsumption, and their lavishness brought its own set of specific dangers.
Okay. But overall, for everyone, the food supply was incredibly tight, always on a knife's edge.
Absolutely. Especially for the poor. Bad weather, too much rain, not enough rain, an early frost, a long winter, or prolonged war could easily mean catastrophic crop failures. And that led directly to widespread famine across entire regions.
The margin for error was razor thin. One poor season could devastate communities for years.
Exactly. During the infamous Great Famine of 1315 to 1317, Europe experienced starvation on a terrifying, almost unimaginable scale.
What happened? What did people do?
Chroniclers from that period recorded horrific accounts of people resorting to eating anything. Cats, dogs, rats, the bark off trees, leather, even the flesh of corpses.
Eating corpses?
Yes. And even in the most extreme, desperate cases, other human beings.
Cannibalism.
Oh my God, that's chilling. How widespread was that? It's hard to say precisely, but there are truly shocking reports of cannibalism when communities utterly ran out of food, the ultimate taboo broken by the ultimate need. Even in normal non-famine years, the average person lived on the absolute edge of hunger. Just a slightly bad harvest could leave entire villages deeply undernourished for months. Hunger wasn't an abstract concept, it was a daily gnawing reality in their stomachs.
And keeping food from spoiling without refrigeration.
An enormous challenge. Meat and dairy spoiled incredibly quickly. People tried various methods to preserve meat, primarily through heavy salting and smoking, but the result was often rancid, worm-infested, and barely edible.
So the effort to preserve food sometimes just resulted in something that was still dangerous and deeply unappetizing.
Pretty much. Rodents and insects frequently found their way into stored grain and meat, contaminating it further. Bread, typically baked only every few days because fuel was precious, would often grow mold if it sat too long in the damp conditions.
Imagine relying on this fragile food supply, knowing that at any moment the very thing meant to sustain you could turn on you.
And this mold could be particularly dangerous. It could be the toxic ergot fungus, especially common on rye grain.
Ergot? What did that do?
Ingesting it led to horrific symptoms known as St. Anthony's fire, or ergotism. It caused violent convulsions, terrifying hallucinations, a burning sensation in the limbs, and eventually gangrene that would blacken and rot fingers, toes, even entire limbs.
Your food turning on you in such a way? Transforming sustenance into a source of madness and physical decay. That's terrifying.
It is. And wine and beer could also sour or be contaminated, sometimes insidiously by lead leaching from pewter vessels or pipes they were stored in.
Lead poisoning.
It certainly happened. Foodborne illnesses like dysentery from spoiled milk or salmonella from rotten eggs were tragically common, though their microbial cause was utterly unknown at the time. The very things meant to nourish could be silent killers, their danger invisible.
The sheer desperation of that time, the constant knot of hunger in your stomach that most people must have lived with. It's hard to wrap your mind around the idea of a whole society existing with such a fragile connection to fundamental survival.
It really is. And clean drinking water was an absolute luxury, far from a given.
We touched on wells being contaminated.
Easily polluted by runoff from streets filled with waste or the open dumping of refuse nearby. Rivers, as we said, were frequently used as open latrines and sometimes tragically held animal or even human corpses. The very arteries of the land, the sources of life, were systematically contaminated.
And you mentioned people accidentally drinking from latrines. How?
Well, if a well was dug too close to a cesspit, seepage could occur. Or if river water downstream from where waste was dumped was used, it could happen. This pervasive danger from water is precisely why fermented beverages like beer and wine were considered safer alternatives for daily consumption.
It paints a vivid, unsettling picture of the utter lack of safe hydration options.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Peasants would drink low-alcohol small beer or diluted wine throughout the day, seeing it as the only viable way to avoid cholera-type outbreaks from raw water.
But even the beer wasn't always safe.
Even beer and wine could transmit harmful microbes if they were poorly brewed or stored in unclean vessels. It was constant negotiation of risk, a choice between obvious danger and a slightly less obvious but still present one.
And famine wasn't just that one time, 13, 15, 17.
Oh no, extreme hunger and widespread famine were not isolated, rare events. They recurred with terrifying regularity, often every decade or two, devastating communities. The Great Famine was particularly bad, killing an estimated 15-20% of people in affected regions.
15 to 20%. That's not just a bad year, it's a demographic catastrophe that reshaped societies.
It was. Laws and records from these times contain heart-wrenching accounts. Starving parents selling their children into servitude just to feed them. Fields of crops left to rot because there was no one left with the strength to harvest them. Dozens of corpses littering the streets.
And that quote, you could smell famine in the streets.
Chilling, isn't it? A terrifying, pervasive odor of desperation and impending death. In severe shortages, starving peasants resorted to eating earth, straw, weeds, anything to fill their bellies.
And the cannibalism and infanticide?
Reported, yes. Even the killing and eating of relatives in the most extreme conditions in Scandinavia and Central Europe, all in the brutal struggle to survive. These are the darkest corners of human desperation, almost unimaginable to us today.
But there was still that stark class divide in diet.
Huge divide. Wealthy nobles lived in a world of gastronomic abundance, their tables literally groaning with vast varieties of food, elaborate pies stuffed with meat and fruit, roast boar, spiced imported fruits, fine wines. They reveled in this excess, a stark and undeniable contrast to the daily gruel of the common people.
But even their privilege came with dangers.
Yes, their rich diets often meant they overate heavily salted and fatty foods. This led to diseases like gout, excruciatingly painful joint inflammation, kidney stones, and ironically, often an early death from things like heart disease or stroke, though they wouldn't have understood it that way. So even amidst abundance, privilege had its own silent forms of decline and suffering.
While peasants.
Peasants, in stark contrast, ate mostly that unchanging gruel and black bread. Maybe watery cheese or occasional salted herring if they were lucky, near the coast. They were chronically underfed, making deficiency diseases like scurvy, from lack of vitamin C, and anemia from lack of iron, incredibly common. Their bodies literally bore the mark of constant deprivation, etched in their bones and weakened health.
And food spoilage was so routine, they tried to test meat.
Yes, people developed folk methods, like seeing if pigs, who would eat almost anything, would eat a piece of meat first. If the pig refused it, maybe you shouldn't eat it either.
Not exactly scientific.
Not at all. Despite these desperate attempts, food poisoning from things like botulism, ergotism from that right fungus, or parasitic infection killed many. The very act of eating was a constant gamble with unseen toxins and pathogens.
And the line between food, medicine, and poison was blurry too.
Very blurry. Herbs, or so-called medicines made from toxic plants like belladonna or hemlock, could accidentally poison patients if the dose was wrong. Even in noble homes, what appeared to be clean tap water could carry deadly pathogens like typhoid, and drinking any raw water could, and often did, lead to life-threatening dysentery.
It's almost hard to grasp the sheer desperation, the constant knot of hunger in your stomach that most people must have lived with daily. It wasn't just a fleeting feeling, it was a baseline reality for generations.
It truly was. And the idea that even your food, your most basic sustenance, could be a source of such terror, causing hallucinations or gangrene. It fundamentally twists your perception of safety and the most basic functions of life.
The simple, seemingly innocuous act of eating or drinking was fraught with risk. It truly underscores how fundamental our modern amenities, refrigeration, clean water, food safety standards are to our very feeling of security and well-being today.
Imagine the subtle, pervasive smell of mold and rancid meat, always lingering in the background, a constant, quiet reminder of the scarcity and the fragility of their existence. Hashtag 3. Medicine, injury, and death.
As we continue this journey, this quiet walk through the past, let's explore what happened when the human body inevitably failed. When injury struck or illness took relentless hold, the methods of care available were, well, startling seems too mild a word, often more terrifying than the affliction itself.
Right. Think about a basic injury today, like breaking your leg. To get x-rays, a cast, pain relief.
Standard procedure.
In the medieval world, if you broke a leg, there was no sophisticated cast, just crude splints made of wood, maybe wrapped with cloth. And if it was a compound fracture where the bone actually pierced the skin...
Oh, that's bad even today.
Back then. It almost always became infected. Gangrene would set in. A painful injury turned into a likely death sentence. A simple accident could very quickly turn fatal.
And wounds from violence, sword cuts, arrows.
Equally grim. A bayonet thrust or a sword slash could sever major blood vessels. Without trained surgeons who understood how to stop bleeding effectively, without blood transfusions, you would simply bleed out quickly. Or, if you somehow survived the initial blood loss, you would almost inevitably develop gangrene in the wound.
So the battlefield was just a place of death.
For the wounded, overwhelmingly yes. A gruesome tableau of inevitable, agonizing death.
And the surgeons, those barber surgeons, what could they actually do?
Their options were brutally limited. They had only alcohol, maybe, or crude herbal opium extracts like laudanum to try and dull the pain, but it often wasn't enough.
So amputation.
Amputations were rushed, performed in under a minute, as we said, purely to spare the agony as much as possible. But still, many patients died right there from the shock of the trauma, or more commonly, from rampant infection afterwards, because antiseptics simply didn't exist.
The speed was less about surgical precision and more about minimizing the screams and the conscious suffering.
Exactly. If you were shot with an arrow, and it remained embedded deep inside you, the situation was dire. Cutting into your guts to try and remove it was seen as pure torture and almost certainly led to fatal infection, peritonitis.
So what was the alternative? Just leave it in?
Often, yes. The choice was frequently to live with a foreign object inside you, hoping it wouldn't kill you, or to face a terrifying, almost certainly fatal intervention, a truly impossible decision.
And childbirth. You mentioned how dangerous it was.
Incredibly dangerous, a journey fraught with peril. Up to 10% of medieval women died in childbirth. That's 1 in 10.
1 in 10? That's staggering.
Yeah. Labor itself could be fatal due to massive hemorrhage that couldn't be stopped, or infection setting in afterwards, puerperal fever, or childbed fever. Or simply if the baby was obstructed, suck in the birth canal.
The miracle of birth was so often tragically intertwined with the specter of death for both mother and child.
And it really was. Medical care for childbirth was incredibly primitive. Midwives, usually experienced older women from the community, might attempt to manually pull babies out or apply various herbs, but serious complications like eclampsia, seizures during pregnancy, or issues with the placenta detaching Usually meant doom for the mother, and often the baby too.
There was precious little they could truly do to intervene effectively in a difficult birth.
Very little. Even queens, with all their wealth and access to personal physicians, died in labor. We mentioned Queen Blanche of Aragon. Despite having doctors attend her through 10 pregnancies, she still died shortly after childbirth in 1310. Status offered no real shield against this most fundamental human vulnerability.
And after birth, even if they survived.
Both mother and infant faced severe infection risks in the days and weeks following. It was tragically common to lose either the mother or the baby, or sometimes both, to infection.
So if you just fell ill, not childbirth, not injury, just sick,
then the cure might truly be worse than the ailment itself. Doctors, basing their treatments on that flawed theory of the four humors.
Right. Bloodletting, leeches.
Exactly. Bleeding you with leeches or making cuts to drain blood, sometimes quite literally draining too much, weakening you further, or even causing death. It was a misguided attempt at rebalancing internal fluids that often went horribly wrong.
And the vomiting and purging.
And administer emetics to make you vomit violently, or harsh purges, laxatives, to expel evil humors from the body, believing they were cleaning you out, but often just dehydrating and exhausting the patient.
And some used astrology.
Oh yes, some practitioners carried intricate charts, volvels, and prescribed drugs or treatments based on astrological signs. They believed the cosmic alignment of stars and planets was directly relevant to your internal health, leading to truly bizarre and completely ineffective prescriptions timed to planetary hours.
And signatures. What was that?
That was another bizarre, intuitive, but wholly unscientific approach. They believed that a plant's appearance indicated what it could cure. So a yellow herb might cure jaundice because of its color, or a heart-shaped plant like lungwort could help with heart or lung pain. This visual resemblance was their guide, not any real understanding of physiology or pharmacology.
And pure superstition. Toads and mummies.
Many cures were pure superstition, bordering on the absurd. Charlatans, and sometimes even respected physicians, peddled potions of crushed dried toads, or, as we mentioned, ground mummy powder, literally powdered remains of Egyptian mummies as remedies for various ailments like epilepsy or internal bleeding.
It truly highlights a desperate belief in anything that promised relief, however outlandish or macabre.
Absolutely. The sheer helplessness in the face of illness, the desperate grasping at anything that might offer some hope, however bizarre. It's a very heavy feeling to consider, that your only options were so often crude, painful, or based purely on superstition.
And no anesthesia for surgery? Just maybe alcohol or opium?
Right. Pain was dealt with primarily by slicing faster, stitching roughly, and maybe pouring vinegar or wine on open wounds, thinking it might cleanse them, though it mostly just stung horribly. The patient was simply expected to endure unimaginable agony, a testament to their fortitude, or perhaps just their lack of any alternative.
And the lack of antiseptics.
Absolutely critical. Surgeons often operated wearing the same blood-stained aprons day after day, their equipment reused without any proper cleaning between patients, and hospital wards where they existed were themselves often cesspools of disease.
So the very places meant for healing often compounded the illness, becoming hubs of infection.
Exactly. After any surgery or major injury, infections like gangrene and sepsis spread unchecked, often leading to a painful, lingering death. Minor wounds, things we wouldn't think twice about today, could eat into flesh. Even small boils or tooth abscesses, which we'd find trivial and easily treatable, killed people regularly.
It's a terrifying thought how close to the edge of death they constantly lived, even from minor ailments.
It is. And doctors often profoundly misunderstood the nature of most diseases. Epilepsy or seizures, for instance, were seen not as neurological conditions, but as demonic possession.
Right. And insanity.
Also thought to be caused by evil spirits entering the body. This lack of understanding led to cruel and ineffective treatments rooted in spiritual fear, compounding the suffering, beating the demon out of someone, for example.
And new diseases, like syphilis.
When syphilis dramatically emerged in Europe around 1490, sufferers were often branded as cursed, seen as receiving divine punishment for sin. One 15th century doctor vividly described the horrific symptoms, the sores, the eruptions, the fever, the eventual blindness. But no true cure existed for centuries. It was a terrifying, disfiguring, and ultimately fatal affliction.
And typhoid.
Just a mysterious, deadly fever. Its cause, it spread via contaminated food and water, completely unknown. The body's betrayal was often interpreted not as biological malfunction, but as divine punishment or a dark curse.
And they blamed animals.
In their desperate search for explanations for things like the plague, they even blamed animals, often accusing mangy dogs or moles of spreading it, completely missing the true vectors like the fleas carried by rats. Anything that moved, anything unusual, was a potential scapegoat for the unseen forces of disease.
And death itself offered little dignity or understanding.
Very little. Autopsies were incredibly rare, largely forbidden by the church as desecration of the body, God's creation. So, causes of death often remain mysterious, fueling supernatural fears and hampering any real medical progress. The body remained a closed book, its internal workings obscured by religious dictate and lack of investigation.
And burials had to be quick.
Especially during epidemics, yes. Bodies had to be quickly buried to avoid what they called pollution of the air, that fear of miasma or bad air, rising from the corpse and spreading disease. Without embalming, corpses bled, bloated, and smelled horrific, adding to the grim reality of widespread death. The sight and pervasive smell of death were ever present, a constant reminder of mortality.
It's a stark reminder of how incredibly fragile life was, how close to the surface death always seemed to be, an almost constant companion in their daily existence.
Absolutely. The idea that even a small cut could quickly become a death sentence, or that the arrival of a new precious life so often tragically meant the end of another, it's incredibly sobering, isn't it?
And the trust they had to place in these incredibly crude, often actively harmful cures. It speaks to a deep underlying fear of the body's betrayal, a feeling of helplessness against its inner workings, pushing them towards anything, however strange, that offered a sliver of hope. Hashtag for punishment, law, and justice.
Moving now beyond the body's internal struggles, let's look at the societal structures, specifically what passed for law and justice in the medieval world. And be warned, the cruelty woven into this system is, well, it's deeply unsettling. It paints a picture of a world where suffering was often a public spectacle and a deliberate tool of control.
Right. We think of law as seeking truth, maybe rehabilitation, but medieval justice sounds like it had very different goals.
Very different. The legal system was shockingly, almost unimaginably brutal. Accused criminals, or even just suspects, could be subjected to extreme torture devices, not just to punish, but primarily to extract confessions, whether those confessions were true or not.
So torture was standard procedure.
For serious crimes or accusations like heresy, yes. Justice was less about rehabilitation and more about terrifying retribution and deterrence through unimaginable pain.
What kind of devices are we talking about?
Imagine, if you can, being flayed alive, having your skin literally peeled from your body while you were still conscious.
Oh, God.
Or being stretched on the rack until your bones audibly popped out of their sockets, your limbs dislocated. They could force you to swallow red-hot iron, searing your insides. Or endure the horrifying Judas cradle, a pyramid-shaped seat of sharp spikes designed to slowly, agonizingly puncture your groin or anus as your weight bore down.
The sheer imagination behind these things is horrifying.
It is. Torturers also used smaller but no less agonizing devices, like thumb screws to crush thumbs, fingers, toes, even teeth, one agonizing turn at a time. And the rack, as mentioned, was a wooden masterpiece of cruelty victims tied by wrists and ankles and literally stretched, dislocating every joint. The ligaments would tear, the bones would dislocate. The agony would be unimaginable, leaving a person permanently broken if they survived.
And the brazen bull, was that real?
Accounts suggest it was. The infamous brazen bull, a hollow metal bowl heated from beneath, designed to roast the victim alive inside. Apparently tubes were fitted so their screams sounded like the bellowing of an animal through the bull's mouth.
That's demonic.
Or the deeply disturbing cages of rats. Strapped to the victim's belly, then heated from the outside until the rats, desperate to escape the heat, gnawed their way into the victim's abdomen. These were not just instruments of pain, but of profound psychological terror, meticulously designed to break the human spirit.
And prison wasn't a respite. Torture happened there, too.
Prison torture was not an exception. It was routine, particularly for those accused by the Church of heresy or witchcraft. Priests themselves often directed or observed the torture of suspected heretics, using contraptions like the heretic's fork.
What was that?
A metal fork with two prongs pointing up under the chin, and two pointing down into the chest, strapped around the neck. It made sleep utterly impossible for days or weeks, forcing confession through sheer exhaustion and pain. Even spiritual accusations were met with horrifying physical torment, highlighting the church's immense power.
And executions weren't private affairs.
Far from it. Public executions were deeply ingrained community entertainment, and a stark, undeniable warning to everyone watching.
What were the common methods?
Thieves were usually hanged, their bodies often left swaying from the gallows for days as a grim lesson. The gallows were a common, almost everyday sight in many town squares.
And for more serious crimes.
Murderers or rapists might be broken on the wheel, their limbs systematically smashed with a heavy iron bar or wooden club, then their broken bodies woven through the spokes of the wheel and hoisted up on a pole, left to die a slow, agonizing death from shock, dehydration, and exposure, often pecked at by birds.
That's medieval doesn't even cover it. Heretics, witches.
Burned alive at the stake. The flames consuming them was seen as a purifying act, destroying the body to potentially save the soul, or at least prevent contamination. It was a terrifying spectacle of ultimate, religiously sanctioned punishment.
Other methods? Drowning.
Even throwing adulterous women into rivers to drown was a practiced form of public execution in some areas. And traitors, those who committed treason against the king or lord, faced the ultimate horror, being drawn and quartered.
Drawn and quartered, what did that actually involve?
It meant they were typically drawn through the streets to the execution site, then hanged until near death, but cut down while still conscious. Then, their genitals were cut off, they were disemboweled, their intestines pulled out and often burned before their eyes, then finally beheaded, and their body chopped into 4 pieces.
While they were still alive?
Often, yes, at least for parts of it. It was a complete, brutal obliteration of the body, a message sent through extreme dismemberment, ensuring nothing remained of the individual, with parts often displayed publicly in different locations.
And the crowds. They watched this.
The crowd would gather in the town square for these spectacles, sometimes jeering and throwing objects, sometimes morbidly fascinated, sometimes calling for a faster death out of a strange, twisted mercy. And often, disturbingly, people kept body parts fingers, bits of rope, or relics from the execution as souvenirs or even magical charms.
Active participation in the suffering. That's hard to imagine today.
It is. The casual public nature of such extreme violence is just. It's profoundly hard to reconcile with our modern understanding of justice or basic human decency. The sheer spectacle of suffering, publicly displayed, was a cornerstone of their society.
And even for minor crimes. Not execution, but...
Mutilation and branding were incredibly common punishments. If you stole a loaf of bread, you weren't typically jailed for a period. You were often punished on the spot with a permanent physical mark. The consequence was immediate, painfully physical, and utterly permanent.
Like what? Cutting off hands?
Yes. Punishments included having hands cut off for theft, or being branded with a hot iron on the cheek or forehead. Pickpockets, for example, might have their nostrils or earlobes slit, permanently marking them with their crime for all to see. There was no escaping the visible, physical mark of your transgression, a constant scarlet letter advertising your past.
Losing fingers.
In some places, petty thieves literally lost digits, a finger or a thumb. Debt or vagrancy could land you in the stocks or pillars, where townsfolk would pelt you with rotten eggs, vegetables, animal dung, even rocks, for an entire day, adding intense public humiliation to physical discomfort and injury. It was a potent, very public weapon of shame.
And prisons themselves. Not places of reform.
Definitely not. They were disease-ridden hellholes, often more akin to dark, damp dungeons. The poor, especially, who couldn't afford to bribe the jailers for better conditions or food, often died in jail before even getting to trial, succumbing to hunger, untreated wounds, and rampant dysentery. Confinement was often a slow, agonizing death sentence in itself, a purgatory before any judgment.
And the justice system relied on superstition too. Ordeals.
Yes, the system itself was drenched in deep superstition. Crimes could be tried by God through various forms of ordeals, where it was genuinely believed that divine intervention would miraculously reveal the truth of guilt or innocence.
How did these ordeals work?
The accused might have to carry a red-hot iron bar for a set distance. Their hand would be bandaged, and if it healed cleanly after 3 days, they were innocent. If it festered, they were guilty.
Festering seems likely with no antiseptics.
Almost guaranteed. Or they might have to plunge an arm into boiling water to retrieve a stone. Same principle for judging the healing. Or face a trial by combat, a physical duel where God was supposedly on the side of the righteous, guiding the innocent party to victory.
And the ordeal by water.
The classic ordeal by water, often used for witchcraft accusations. The accused, usually a woman, was bound, hands tied to feet, and thrown into a pond or river.
Here.
If she sank and drowned, she was proved innocent, having been accepted by the pure water. If she floated, however...
She was guilty, because the pure water rejected her.
Exactly. She was deemed guilty of witchcraft, pulled out, and then summarily executed, usually by burning. The logic was perverse, but deeply held and terrifyingly final.
Did the church approve of these?
Initially, priests often oversaw them. But by the 13th century, the church formally banned priest-assisted ordeals, seeing them as tempting God. But the practices themselves often continued, adapted in local customs and secular courts. Essentially, if you fail an ordeal, you were almost certainly executed. The outcome was almost always fatal, regardless of actual guilt, leaving very little room for survival.
And you could be accused just on suspicion.
Even mere suspicion was deadly. You could be arrested and tortured on the flimsiest of rumors, whispered accusations from a jealous neighbor or a rival. Inquisitors interrogated suspects for heresy or witchcraft with little to no concrete evidence needed, relying entirely on fear and coerced confessions extracted through torture. The whisper of a neighbor could swiftly destroy a life.
And people confessed under torture.
Of course. People often confessed under extreme, unbearable pain to any crime, real or imagined, just to make the torture stop. The breaking point was always reached, and the confession was extracted, regardless of truth or innocence, leaving a terrible legacy of injustice.
Can you give an example of this cruelty in action?
There are chilling examples of this collective cruelty, like the massacre of Béziers in 1209 during the Albigensian Crusade against the Cathar heretics in southern France.
What happened there?
When the Crusader army reached the city, they demanded the Cathars within be handed over. The city refused. The papal legate commanding the army, Arnaud Amari, famously, chillingly, issued the order. Kill them all. God will know his own.
Kill everyone. Catholics, too.
Everyone. The result was the indiscriminate slaughter of virtually the entire town. Thousands upon thousands, Cathars and Catholics alike, men, women, children. It was a horrific act of indiscriminate violence under the guise of religious zeal, wiping out a whole community in a single day.
And the bodies afterwards. Public display.
Guards would often parade severed heads on pikes through towns or burn bodies in public squares as spectacles, leaving a lasting, indelible impression of terror and the absolute power of the authorities, whether secular or religious. These horrific images were burned into the collective consciousness of the populace. The sheer casual brutality of it all, isn't it? The way suffering and pain were not just administered, but woven into the very fabric of public life, as entertainment, as warning. It's profoundly hard to imagine living under that constant arbitrary shadow of pain and violence, where your life could be forfeited at any moment based on suspicion or ordeal.
The thought that your innocence might literally be determined by whether you drown or float in a pond, it truly turns every modern concept of justice and reason completely on its head. It's an almost alien worldview.
And the way people seem to participate in it, even enjoy it, gathering for these gruesome spectacles, it truly speaks to a fundamentally different kind of human experience, so far removed from our own sensibilities today. #JagTag5. Daily life for peasants.
Okay, let's shift our focus now. We've talked a lot about the general environment, the dangers, the justice system. But what about the lives of the vast majority of people during the Middle Ages? The peasants, the serfs. Their existence sounds like it was just endurance. A relentless cycle of effort, dictated by the land and the seasons.
That's a very good way to put it. Endurance. It was a life of constant hard labor and very, very few comforts. Peasant life was an endless, exhausting cycle of hard labor, literally from dawn to dusk, always out in the fields when the weather permitted.
No weekends, no holidays off.
There were holy days, saints' days, maybe some festival days off, but no concept of a regular weekend. You worked the land every single day that the weather allowed, plowing with heavy ox-drawn plows, sowing seeds by hand, endless weeding, and then the back-breaking harvest. Your very life, your family's survival, was dictated entirely by the seasons and the unrelenting demands of the soil.
And it wasn't just their own little patch of land, right? They owed labor to the Lord.
Exactly. Villagers, particularly serfs, had to fulfill unpaid obligations to their lord, known as the corvée. This meant working the lord's personal fields, his domain land, for a set number of days per week, or repairing roads, bridges, fences on the manor, all for free.
So an additional layer of grueling labor piled on top of their already backbreaking work just to feed themselves. A constant drain on their limited time and energy.
Precisely. And women's days were equally, if not more, demanding. They were up before dawn to grind grain by hand with heavy cornstones, or take it to the Lord's mill and pay a fee. Churn butter, make cheese, bake bread in a communal oven, another fee, cook hearth meals over an open fire, care for the pigs and chickens, fetch water, and somehow attend to the many children.
And then they went to the fields.
Often, yes. After all that domestic labor, they frequently joined the men in the fields for the strenuous agricultural work, especially during planting and harvest time. Their lives were a relentless juggling act of both domestic and agricultural duties, basically working constantly.
And no safety regulations, obviously.
Of course not. No labor laws, no safety gear. They used heavy, rudimentary iron plows, sickles, scythes, all with sheer muscle power, often working barefoot in the fields.
Barefoot? Why?
Shoes were often a luxury, made of leather and wore out quickly. Going barefoot saved the shoes for harder ground or winter, but it meant feet were constantly cut, bruised, infected. Accidents like burns from hearths, deep cuts from tools, or broken bones from Fulgus were incredibly common, often leading to lifelong disability or early death in a world with no effective medical care. Every single task carried a significant physical risk.
And their homes, what were they like?
A peasant family typically lived in a tiny single-room hovel, usually made of wattle and daub that's woven branches, plastered with a mix of mud, dung, and straw, or maybe rough logs if timber was available. The roof would be thatch, or sometimes sod.
And the floor?
Just packed dirt, often damp, maybe covered with some loose straw or rushes, which, as we discussed, wasn't changed often and became quite foul. It was a basic rudimentary shelter, offering very little in terms of protection from the elements, pests, or real comfort.
And everyone slept in that one room?
Everyone. Parents, children, sometimes even grandparents, all slept crammed together on rough straw mattresses, or just piles of straw on the floor, side by side.
No privacy at all?
Absolutely non-existent. And in cold weather, they often brought their precious animals inside the hovel for warmth, pigs, chickens, maybe even a calf or a cow if they owned one. The animal's body heat supplemented the meager heat from the central hearth fire.
So you're sleeping next to your family and your pig?
Pretty much. The intimate closeness with animals was a practical necessity for survival in winter, but surely added immensely to the overwhelming smells, the filth, and the unsanitary conditions within that tiny, crowded space.
Cooking, dining, sleeping, animals.
All in one dank space.
All in full view of everyone. Smoke from the indoor hearth stove, usually with no proper chimney, just a hole in the roof, filled the house constantly. It gave everything and everyone a constant, pervasive soot smell that clung to clothes, hair, lungs. This pervasive odor, combined with the extreme lack of personal space, defined their entire living environment.
What about clothing? Another significant hardship. Peasants typically had only a few sets of clothes for their entire lives. Maybe one slightly better tunic or dress, their Sunday best for church, and one or two rough tunics and trousers or skirts for daily work.
Made of what? Wool?
Usually coarse wool, which was itchy and hard to clean, or maybe linen if they grew flax. These garments were often patched repeatedly until they were threadbare and very rarely washed properly. Water hauling and heating were laborious and soap was expensive.
So sweaty clothes weren't changed often.
Sweaty undergarments, if they even had them, went unchanged for days, maybe weeks. Meaning fleas, lice, and painful chafing were constant companions, a relentless, irritating presence. The itch, the physical discomfort, was an ever-present part of their physical experience, something they simply endured from morning till night.
And shoes were a luxury, feet constantly cut and muddy.
Yes. In winter, they often slept in the same clothes they wore all day, just to try and stay warm against the biting cold and damp that seeped into their poorly built homes, into their very bones.
And in the mud outside.
With open cesspits and animal pens nearby, and no paved roads or proper drainage, villages often turned into quagmires on a rainy day. People would get covered in thick, clinging mud. It was a world of constant grime, clinging to their clothes and skin, a visual and tactile reminder of their surroundings. It's just an exhausting picture, isn't it? The sheer physical toll of that kind of unending labor, year after year, generation after generation, with so few comforts, so little respite. It's hard to imagine that level of continuous exertion and discomfort.
And legally, they were bound to the land. Serfs.
Many were, yes. Serfs were not slaves. They couldn't be bought and sold individually, but they were legally bound to the land and owed almost everything to their lord who owned that land. They couldn't leave the manor, marry, or even inherit property without the lord's permission.
And they paid taxes. Tithes.
Oh, yes. They paid burdensome tithes, a tax of 10% of all their crops and livestock to the church, plus they paid various rents in cash, crops, or labor, and fees to the noble who owned their land. Their hard-earned produce was constantly chipped away at, leaving them with barely enough to survive, let alone get ahead.
Fees for what?
Fees for everything. Using the Lord's mill to grind their grain. Using the Lord's oven to bake their bread. Fees for getting married. Fees when a parent died. Harriet. Even seemingly basic activities like fishing in the local stream often required permission and payment.
Failure to pay. Or a bad harvest.
Could result in swift, severe punishment. Having tools or animals confiscated, eviction from their land, beatings or imprisonment. Every aspect of their lives was controlled, every resource taxed.
And the church owned land, too.
The church was one of the largest landowners in Europe, so peasants often worked church lands and also gave gifts and labor to local monasteries. And there was virtually no social mobility. You were born a serf, you died a serf. Your fate was as fixed and immovable as the piece of land you worked. Your path was rigidly laid out from birth, with almost no hope of escape or advancement.
What about safety? Policing?
Villages had no formal police force. The countryside could be dangerous and unpredictable. Bandits, desperate outlaws, or roving mercenary soldiers, often unpaid and desperate after wars, might attack villages for food or coin, bringing sudden, brutal violence and terror. The threat of external violence was always present, an additional danger to supplement the internal hardships of their lives.
And medical help?
Rarely came to the remote villages, as we discussed.
Yeah.
Proper physicians were city-based and expensive, so illnesses in the village were met with often ineffective folk remedies, herbal concoctions, prayers, and superstitions passed down through generations.
And children started working immediately?
Almost immediately. From as young as 5, they were contributing. Herding geese or pigs, carrying water, tending fires, scaring birds from crops. Instead of schooling, their childhood was a swift, brutal transition to labor.
Any toys? Recreation?
Almost none. Maybe a crude wooden stick fashioned into a doll or a sword, a ball made of rags. Recreation was minimal, perhaps a rare village festival with dancing and ale or church holidays, but usually life was far too hard and demanding for any sustained leisure. Joy was fleeting, often overshadowed by the relentless demands of basic survival.
So overall, peasant life was just poverty, backbreaking work, filth, and hunger on repeat.
Generation after generation. It was a relentless existence with very little hope for change or improvement within their lifetime, or even their children's lifetime.
And epidemics hit them hard.
With the filth, fleas, and rats everywhere, epidemics like the plague ravaged villages with terrifying frequency and intensity. If the Black Death or any major plague struck, bodies might lie unburied for days in huts, the living too afraid, too sick, or too few to move them. The devastation was absolute, leaving silent homes and desolate fields in its wake.
And losing children was common.
Many families lost most of their children before age 5. Grief and fear were constant companions, an ever-present hum in their lives. Due to poor nutrition and unsanitary conditions, childhood diseases like measles, mumps, smallpox, chickenpox, whooping cough, alongside ever-present threats like malaria and even leprosy in some areas, were endemic. Loss was a routine, tragically expected part of existence.
And they could turn on each other, too. Witchcraft accusations.
Yes. To compound all these woes, a frayed, desperate peasant might also be condemned for superstition or witchcraft by their neighbors, especially if they were old, female, and perhaps practiced herbal remedies. The fear of the unknown and the desperate search for scapegoats in times of hardship often turned neighbor against neighbor, adding another layer of internal terror and mistrust. To live a life where every single day was just about survival, where comfort was a fleeting, almost forgotten dream, and the future was simply more of the same, with no promise of improvement, it feels profoundly heavy, doesn't it? The sheer weight of that existence.
The constant smell of smoke and animals in a tiny, cramped hut, the perpetual ache in your muscles from unending labor, the knowledge that your destiny was fixed from birth, unchangeable. It's hard to imagine the sheer endurance required just to get through each day, each year.
You can almost hear the soft rustle of that dirty straw on the packed earth floor, feel the dampness seeping up beneath bare feet, a constant, quiet presence that speaks volumes about their grounded, unyielding, and incredibly difficult reality. #6, Death in the Afterlife Obsession.
Given everything we've just discussed, the filth, the disease, the hunger, the violence, it's really no surprise, is it, that the presence of death loomed incredibly large over medieval life. It wasn't something hidden away or whispered about politely.
Not at all. It was everywhere. In plain sight, unavoidable, permeating their consciousness, their art, their religious beliefs, their entire framework for understanding the world.
Medieval people lived with mortality as a constant, intimate companion. We mentioned the life expectancy.
Right. If you were born in the 14th century, for instance, there was a stark, sobering 1 in 2 chance you'd die before reaching the age of 30. Offered from disease, sudden violence, or the perils of childbirth, life was incredibly short and perpetually precarious. A fragile flame, always flickering in the wind of fate.
And families experienced loss constantly.
Regularly, devastating household deaths, losing parents, siblings, and, as we said, most commonly their children. And during the terrifying plague outbreaks, like the Black Death.
The streets filled with corpses.
Literally. Filled with corpses that no one dared touch or could touch. The sheer volume of death overwhelming the living, breaking down social order, overwhelming any capacity for proper burial.
You mentioned Nuremberg.
A particularly vivid example, though later in the mid-1600s, but reflecting the same reality. After a plague surge killed about 30,000 people there, officials were so overwhelmed they literally piled thousands of bodies into vast mass graves outside the town walls. Just huge pits filled with the dead.
Imagine the scale of that loss, the endless line of the dead, a stark testament to humanity's vulnerability.
And skeletal pits from these periods found by archaeologists tell the same story. Men, women, and countless children huddled together, sometimes even found in seated positions because of how they were dumped in, buried in a desperate hurry, often without proper rights or individual dignity. They were simply discarded, heaped together in anonymous despair. A haunting record of mass suffering.
So churches and consecrated ground couldn't handle it.
Completely overwhelmed during epidemics or after mass slaughters from war. Farmland or nearby forests might hide vast, anonymous trenches of bodies, hurriedly dug and quickly covered. The landscape itself, in many places, effectively became a vast, unmarked graveyard beneath the surface.
And priests were rushing burials because of miasma.
Yes, they raced through quick burial rites, often deeply fearful of that pollution of the air, the belief in miasma or bad air rising from decaying corpses and spreading disease. In peacetime, burying the poor and unidentified often happened in shallow pits anyway, which sometimes leaked foul odors through the village, the stench of decay, a constant, subtle reminder of the recent dead nearby.
And failure to bury quickly had other consequences.
Even more grim realities. Animals, dogs, or pigs scavenging and chewing on bodies left exposed, or thieves digging up fresh graves to steal clothes, shrouds, or any valuable grave goods buried with the person. The indignity of the grave, the further desecration of the dead, was a chilling and ever-present possibility.
So, because death was so ubiquitous, so inescapable, art and religion fixated on it.
Absolutely. They wove it into the very fabric of their cultural expression. The church, especially, preached constant fear and awareness of mortality. Everyone was but a day's journey from death, a stark and relentless reminder. This fear was deeply embedded, profoundly shaping their worldview and daily choices.
And the art reflected this, the dance of death.
Famously, yes. Paintings and woodcuts of the Dance Macabre or Dance of Death were everywhere, lining city walls, inside churches, and printed books of hours. These showed leering skeletons leading figures from all walks of life. Popes, emperors, nobles, merchants, peasants, children alike, hand in hand, to the grave.
A stark, visual, inescapable reminder of their shared, inevitable fate. No one escapes.
No one. Sermons passionately urged confession and penance for sins, instilling a deep sense of urgency. People genuinely, fervently believed that dying without receiving the last rites, confession, communion, extreme unction, meant eternal damnation. Their soul would be lost, left to wander as a ghost or demon, or burned forever in the vividly imagined fires of hell.
That's intense pressure.
Immense. Tales of hell with its gruesome tortures and stories of ghosts and demons were everywhere. Even young children learned prayers of death at the bedside of their sick, dying parents or siblings. The spiritual torment, the fear of what came after, was as real and terrifying to them as any physical suffering.
That constant gnawing fear of damnation, coupled with the ever-present sight and smell of death all around them. It must have profoundly shaped their every waking moment, every decision, every interaction. It's almost hard for us to conceive of that level of spiritual anxiety.
It is. This was undeniably a memento mori culture. Remember, you must die. A constant, pervasive reminder. Manuscripts showed vivid illustrations of human heads being scythed off by the Grim Reaper, a skeletal figure representing death. People wore mourning rings, sometimes shaped like skulls or skeletons or other small tokens to keep death at the forefront of their minds. Every visual cue reinforced the fragility and brevity of human life.
Even tombs showed decay.
Often, yes. Tomb effigies, the sculptures on top of tombs, frequently depicted the corpse not in a serene, idealized state, but in a decayed, emaciated condition called a transient tomb. Sometimes showing worms crawling, skin peeling back to reveal bone, starkly reminding viewers, as I am now, so you shall be. There was no softening or sanitizing the harsh reality of physical decay and mortality.
And holy days focused on death, too.
Holy days and saints' feasts often commemorated martyrs who suffered gruesome deaths, or focused on prayers for dead souls in purgatory, further integrating death into their religious calendar and collective consciousness. Even daily motifs, like the constant act of cleaning cathedrals, or the way churchyards were often dug up and bones moved to ossuaries to make room for new burials, the composting of the dead, essentially subtly reinforced mortality. Death was woven into the very fabric of their daily rituals and routines.
So with the constant threat of dying young, people obsessed over salvation.
Absolutely. Securing a place in the afterlife became a primary concern. The rich, in particular, paid vast sums for elaborate masses to be said for their souls after death. Endowed chapels, chantries, where priests would pray for them in perpetuity, commissioned elaborate tombs, hoping to ensure constant prayers to shorten their time in purgatory. Wealth was often channeled into buying spiritual comfort, a perceived pathway to a better afterlife.
And for ordinary people,
Charitable acts, arduous pilgrimages to holy sites like Canterbury or Rome or Jerusalem, and relic veneration, the intense worship of bits of saints' bones, fragments of their clothing, vials believed to contain their blood or tears were all believed to earn merit, gain divine favor, and help ward off hell.
and the church held the keys.
The church held ultimate, terrifying power over this. Your local priest literally could condemn your soul, refuse you sacraments if you didn't confess your sins or abide by its dictates. This religious authority was absolute, holding sway over life and death, both earthly and eternal.
Which instilled profound terror.
Profound existential terror in the average person. The poor peasant genuinely believed that a single unconfessed sin, even a fleeting bad thought or moment of doubt, could send their immortal soul to eternal fire. It was an overwhelming spiritual burden, a constant state of self-scrutiny and fear of divine wrath that permeated everything.
It's just overwhelming to consider the sheer weight of spiritual fear that was carried every single day, permeating every decision and interaction. The constant pressure.
It is the profound silence of a mass grave, the urgent, desperate digging to keep ahead of the dying, the smell of fear mixed with decay lingering in the air. It's a scene that's hard to shake from your mind, isn't it? That reality.
And the art that surrounded them, whether in grand cathedrals painted with scenes of the Last Judgment or simple woodcuts showing the dance of death, constantly reminding them of their own inevitable end. It was a world entirely saturated with the thought of what came next, what awaited them beyond this fragile, often brutal life. Hashtag 7. War, violence, and random death.
And beyond the relentless pressures of disease, hunger, and that deep spiritual fear, there was yet another layer of danger. The constant, ever-present threat of human-made chaos. Let's talk about war and violence, which were incredibly pervasive, brutal, and often completely arbitrary in the medieval world.
Right. It wasn't just about survival against nature or disease. It was about survival against other people.
Exactly. Warfare in the medieval period was, frankly, absolute hell. There were very few rules of engagement as we might understand them today. No Geneva Conventions protecting civilians and prisoners. It was often a chaotic free-for-all, driven by conquest, plunder, dynastic ambition, and sometimes just pure, unadulterated savagery.
So armies on the march weren't just passing through.
Far from it. Armies marching through the countryside were often instruments of terror for the local population. They would seize food and supplies, livestock, anything they needed or wanted. And frequently, they engaged in chevauchés, deliberately burning villages, destroying crops, orchards, mills, basically crippling the enemy's economy and terrorizing the populace, sometimes for what seemed like sheer sport or profit alongside strategic goals.
And siege warfare.
Particularly brutal. It meant civilians trapped inside a besieged city or castle would slowly starve, often alongside the defending soldiers, until the fortification inevitably fell. Disease would run rampant in the crowded, unsanitary conditions.
And when the city fell.
Only then, after weeks or months of suffering, would the surviving inhabitants often face a final horror, being massacred indiscriminately by the conquering army or rounded up and sold into slavery. When a castle was breached, its defenders and often any peasants who had sought refuge inside could all be slaughtered without mercy. Surrender rarely meant reprieve. Often it just meant a more controlled but no less brutal form of death or enslavement.
And the wounds from medieval weapons.
Unspeakably gruesome. Arrow shafts protruding from guts, maces crushing skulls, swords hacking off limbs with blunt force, crossbow bolts piercing armor, battering rams crushing bodies against walls.
And battlefield surgery.
Those desperate barber surgeons we spoke of, doing their best with limited knowledge. Simply amputating mangled limbs to try and stop bleeding again, often with no effective anesthetic. The screams would have been horrific, echoing across the battlefield, a terrifying symphony of suffering.
An infection afterwards.
Infection in a battlefield wound was not just a possibility. It was a near certainty and an almost guaranteed death sentence. There were no ambulances, no sterile field hospitals, no tetanus shots, no antibiotics. A seemingly minor wound could quickly turn gangrenous, leading to a slow, agonizing demise, often far from any kind of care or comfort.
So even outside of official wars, life was dangerous.
Extremely. Soldiers on leave or unpaid mercenaries between contracts or just desperate bandit gangs could raid villages for loot, food, or to commit terrible acts of violence, especially against women. Rape was endemic in wartime, almost an expected horror. The line between soldier and criminal was often incredibly blurred, making the countryside a lawless, terrifying place, especially during periods of conflict or instability.
And feuds between nobles.
Right. Feuds between powerful noble families, often over land, inheritance, or perceived insults, frequently spilled onto the innocent peasant populations who worked their lands. Peasants might be caught in the crossfire, have their homes burned, or be taken as hostages, tortured, or summarily executed simply to exert pressure on their lords. Their lives were just pawns in larger power struggles they had no part in initiating or controlling.
And simple crime. Could that turn violent quickly?
Yes. A minor insult, a drunken brawl, a baseless rumor, or a deep-seated superstition could trigger a terrifying lynching by a local mob. There were no formal police forces beyond the lord's appointed reeve or bailiff, who were often distant, ineffective, or corrupt. Vigilantes frequently took matters into their own hands, dispensing their own swift, brutal form of justice based on accusation rather than proof.
So the fear of just disappearing
Was very real. If you were accused of witchcraft, serious theft, or simply lived near the wrong vengeful person, you might simply vanish one night, abducted and killed, never to be seen again, your fate unknown. Justice was often arbitrary and deadly swift.
The instability of it all, the chilling sense that danger could erupt from anywhere, at any time, often without warning or reason. It must have created a constant uneasy tension in the air, a low hum of anxiety and potential violence that never truly dissipated.
Absolutely. There were no truly safe zones, not even for children. Boys as young as 12 could be conscripted as squires or foot soldiers. Pages in noble households, learning the arts of war, thrust into the grim realities of battle far too young. Childhood innocence, where it existed, was shattered early, replaced by the harsh, violent demands of a militarized society.
And towns had militias. Peasants had to fight.
Towns had to maintain their own militias for defense, and peasants could be, and often were, drafted with their pitchforks, axes, and farm tools into a lord's army, or a last-ditch defense against invaders. They were poorly equipped, poorly trained, and often just fodder in battles fought by knights and professional soldiers.
And kings and nobles fought constantly.
Kings and nobles fought personal wars frequently, often over inheritance disputes, dynastic claims, or simple ambition, dragging entire regions and their populations into devastating conflicts that had little to do with the common person's life, yet demanded their service and sacrifice.
The 100 Years' War being a prime example.
A classic, horrifying example of this protracted, devastating violence between England and France, lasting intermittently from the 14th to 15th centuries. Armies repeatedly marched across France, burning vast swaths of fields, destroying livelihoods, raping entire villages. It introduced new atrocities like the massacres after battles like Crécy and Agincourt, where French knights were slaughtered by English longbowmen and thousands of fleeing common soldiers were killed indiscriminately. It was a prolonged period of horrific violence and widespread devastation for the civilian population.
And no protection for civilians.
While knights might have had some semblance of chivalric codes among themselves, though often ignored, there was effectively no honor or protection afforded to non-combatants, especially peasants. After battles, widespread looting of the dead in the surrounding area and rape of local women were not just common. They were considered normal spoils of war, an accepted brutal part of the victor's reward. The concept of civilian immunity simply didn't exist in any meaningful way.
And sieges ended in massacre.
Often. We mentioned the Fourth Crusade in 1204, a particularly egregious example. When Christian crusaders, diverted from their goal in the Holy Land, sacked the fellow Christian city of Constantinople, the richest city in Christendom.
They just destroyed it.
They raped, killed, and looted on a massive scale. Large numbers of civilians were murdered purely for sport or greed, driven by a toxic mix of religious fervor, political intrigue, and avarice. The brutality was not always strategic. Sometimes it was pure, unchecked savagery, even against those supposedly of the same faith.
And prisoners weren't safe either.
Executions of prisoners of war, or those who had surrendered, could be entirely capricious. Ransom was common for nobles, but common soldiers might be killed out of hand. A baseless rumor, a commander's whim, or simple convenience could lead to the killing of an opponent who thought they were safe under terms of surrender. There was no guarantee of safety, even after laying down arms. To live in a world where true peace felt like a fleeting exception, a brief pause between conflicts, and random arbitrary violence was always a looming, immediate possibility. It must have instilled a deep, almost instinctual fear that was woven into the very fabric of daily existence.
The distant, unsettling sound of marching armies on the horizon, the screams from a nearby village carried on the wind, the sight of a burning farmhouse against the night sky. These weren't abstract concepts or stories from afar. They were terrifying, tangible realities that could arrive at your doorstep without warning.
And the idea that your life, your family, your entire existence could be snuffed out at any moment by arbitrary force, by a soldier's whim or a bandit's greed, with little or no recourse. It truly makes you feel the profound fragility of it all, a vulnerability that is hard for us to truly grasp from the relative safety of our modern world. Hashtag tag 8 the church, fear and control.
Okay, so beyond the tangible, brutal dangers of the medieval world, the disease, the hunger, the violence, there was this other, equally powerful, perhaps even more pervasive force shaping every single aspect of life. The church. Its influence wasn't just gentle spiritual guidance, was it?
Oh, not at all. It was absolute pervasive control. It permeated every decision, every thought, every ritual, every moment from birth until long after death.
Every aspect of life.
Literally every significant aspect. Births were registered and blessed through baptism by priests. Marriages were holy sacraments performed exclusively by the church, legally binding. And death rites, confession, last rites, burial, and consecrated ground were deemed essential for the soul's passage, all controlled by priests. From the cradle to the grave, the church dictated the rituals and provided the soul-accepted spiritual framework for existence.
And the tithes. The church tax.
Yes, you pay tithes, a literal tax to the church, usually 10% of all your crops, livestock, maybe even other income. The church owned vast amounts of land across Europe, often more than kings or the greatest nobles. So your very livelihood, your ability to farm and survive, often directly depended on renting church land or its goodwill. It wasn't just a spiritual institution, it was an immense economic powerhouse, deeply integrated into the feudal system, holding tremendous earthly power.
And the ultimate threat was excommunication.
Perhaps the most terrifying power they held. The clergy could excommunicate you, formally cast you out of the church, cutting you off from all sacraments, from Christian community, from hope of salvation, for any perceived rebellion, heresy, or serious disobedience. This was a fate far more terrifying to medieval people than even physical death itself, because it was believed to doom your immortal soul to eternal damnation in hell. It was the ultimate spiritual weapon, wielded with absolute authority to maintain control.
So they constantly emphasized sin.
Constantly. Priests relentlessly reminded people of sin, of their innate fallen nature inherited from Adam and Eve. Every natural human impulse, desire, anger, pride, even doubt was suspect, potentially a gateway to sin. If you missed Mass or worked unnecessarily on a Sunday or a holy day, you didn't just feel a little guilty. You felt profound, soul-deep guilt and fear, fearing for your eternal salvation. The weight of potential sin was a constant, heavy burden.
Even a sneeze could be seen as the devil.
There were folk beliefs like that, yes. That the devil could enter your body during a sneeze, hence the blessing, God bless you. Confession, usually at least once a year before Easter, was mandatory and deeply ingrained into the rhythm of life. Villagers would confess their sins to the priest, sometimes even fantasized or exaggerated ones, fearing eternal damnation more than earthly punishment. The confessional box was a place of immense psychological power and deep-seated fear.
And the fear of dying without rights.
The average person genuinely believed their soul was incredibly fragile. Dying suddenly without receiving the last rites, or dying with unconfessed mortal sins on your soul, meant almost certain damnation, perhaps wandering the earth as a tormented ghost or demon, or burning forever in the graphically depicted fires of hell. This profound terror of the afterlife colored every decision, every interaction, and shaped their entire moral landscape.
That weight of spiritual fear, constantly, relentlessly bearing down on every thought and action, every small moment. It's hard for us to imagine living with such intense internal scrutiny and the ever-present dread of eternal consequences hanging over you.
It really is. The church, very explicitly, very effectively, used fear as a primary tool of control. Heresy, any belief or practice outside the meticulously defined, rigid church doctrine, was not tolerated in the slightest. It was punishable by torture and ultimately by a painful death, usually burning. Deviance of thought was brutally suppressed.
So religious minorities faced persecution.
Heretics, Jews, sometimes Muslims within Christian lands were often subjected to widespread legal discrimination and persecution, sometimes leading to horrific local pogroms where entire communities were attacked, robbed, and slaughtered by inflamed mobs, often with tacit or explicit approval from authorities.
And the Inquisition.
The medieval Inquisition, established formally in the 13th century, was a powerful church institution specifically designed to root out heresy. It systematically used investigation, informants, and often brutal torture to extract confessions from suspected non-believers or those deviating from orthodoxy. It implemented a chillingly systematic suppression of any dissenting thought or faith.
And witch trials came later.
Witch trials became much more prevalent in the later Middle Ages, and especially into the early modern period, but the groundwork was laid earlier. These were truly horrific persecutions, targeting mostly old, poor, often widowed women who fit a certain stereotype. An estimated 35,000 to perhaps 60,000 alleged witches were brutally executed across Europe, primarily between 1450 and 1750. It was a terrifying wave of misogyny, fear, and scapegoating, fueled by religious fervor, social anxieties, and printed manuals like the Malleus Maleficarum.
And people blamed witches for everything.
People blamed the devil, and by extension his earthly agents like witches, for everything bad that happened. Sudden illnesses, livestock dying, devastating crop failures, storms. They looked for witches or heretics to blame. It was a desperately convenient way to explain the unexplainable, to find human agents for inexplicable suffering and misfortune in a world without a strong scientific understanding of cause and effect.
So superstition thrived over science.
Absolutely. With the church as the ultimate arbiter of truth and knowledge, superstition often thrived, frequently at the expense of nascent science or rational inquiry. Illness was seen not primarily as a biological malfunction caused by germs, which were unknown, but often as a direct result of sin or demonic curse. Reason was often subservient to deeply held, often terrifying religious beliefs.
And mental illness was seen as possession.
Almost universally believed to be demonic possession. The cure, therefore, was not care or therapy, but exorcism. Priests would perform rituals, sometimes involving physical restraint, beatings, or starvation, believing they were driving out evil spirits. Imagine the unspeakable suffering of those deemed possessed, subject to such cruel and misguided interventions, their agony only compounded by these false beliefs.
Astrology was taken seriously, even by kings.
Deeply seriously. Astrology guided daily choices for many. Kings and nobles employed court astrologers and literally made decisions about war, treaties, marriage, and travel based on complex star charts and interpretations of celestial alignments. They genuinely believed the heavens dictated earthly events.
Harvest failures led to scapegoating.
Immediately. The poor, outsiders like Jews or local cunning folk, village healers who sometimes used charms, were often accused of cursing the fields or causing the bad weather through magic.
And people prayed to relics.
Fervently. Bits of saints' bones, fragments of their clothing, vials supposedly containing their blood or tears. These relics were housed in elaborate reliquaries in churches and cathedrals. People made arduous pilgrimages, sometimes hundreds of miles, to shrines housing important relics, believing these physical objects were direct conduits to divine power, offering a desperate hope for healing, protection, or miracles in a world without effective medicine or much control over fate.
And science was suppressed.
Science or rational thought was actively suppressed if it appeared to contradict scripture or establish church doctrine. Think of Galileo centuries later, but the principle was there earlier. Questioning the divinely ordained order of the universe, even suggesting something like the Earth orbiting the Sun, could get you labeled a heretic, imprisoned, or even, in extreme cases, executed. Intellectual curiosity, if it strayed too far from dogma, was often dangerous.
And the church sold things, indulgences, relics.
The church engaged in practices that seem highly commercialized to us. They sold indulgences, certificates promising remission of time spent suffering in purgatory for sins already forgiven in confession. This became a huge source of revenue and controversy. And they sold, or at least profited from pilgrimages to see holy relics. These relics were considered priceless, sometimes leading to theft by rival churches or priests raiding tombs, because people genuinely believed that ingesting dust from a saint's tomb or touching a relic could cure illness or grant blessings. It was a thriving, often morally ambiguous economy built on faith, fear, and desperation.
And people ate mummies and body parts as medicine.
Incredibly, yes. Medieval Europeans, even into the 17th and 18th centuries, practiced medical cannibalism. We mentioned mummy powder. Doctors also prescribed remedies containing human skull, blood, fat, or bone marrow, believing in that principle of like cures like, or that these substances contained a vital life force. The boundary between piety, medicine, and fear was profoundly blurred. Prayers, attending mass, venerating relics, these were quite literally seen as vital acts for keeping death, disease, and the ever-present devil at bay. This desperation led to truly bizarre and grim practices, sanctioned by widespread belief and even medical theory of the time. It's a profound sense of living under a constant, unwavering spiritual gaze, where every choice, every thought, every impulse carried immediate and potentially eternal consequences. The pressure must have been immense.
The quiet, gnawing dread of falling out of favor with the church, knowing it meant not just earthly punishment like imprisonment or execution, but unimaginable torment beyond this life. It's a terrifying, all-encompassing weight to carry.
And the way reason and genuine curiosity were so often stifled, suppressed, replaced by these intricate, often terrifying beliefs and superstitions, all enforced by this powerful institution. It fundamentally changes your entire way of understanding the world and your small, precarious place within it. #, 9, children, education, and growing up.
After all this, the disease, the violence, the fear, you have to wonder about the children. What was childhood actually like in this world? It sounds like it was profoundly far from the protected innocence we try to cultivate today.
You're absolutely right. There was simply no concept of childhood innocence as we understand it. Children were essentially seen and treated as miniature adults from a very, very young age. The idea of a separate protected period, primarily for growth, play, education, and discovery, was largely absent from their world, especially for the vast majority who weren't noble.
So they started working very young.
Extremely young. From the tender age of 5 or 6, peasant children were expected to contribute significantly to the family's survival. Fetching water from the well or stream, minding younger siblings while parents worked, feeding the chickens or pigs, gathering firewood, weeding the garden. Their labor was essential, not optional.
And by 7 or 10?
By age 7 to 10, many boys were already doing light work in the fields alongside their fathers, or perhaps apprenticed to a local craftsman, a blacksmith, a carpenter, a weaver to learn a trade. Girls by that age were deeply involved in learning all the domestic skills needed to run a household: cooking, spinning wool, weaving cloth, making clothes, tending the hearth fire.
Was there any schooling?
For the vast majority, virtually none. Formal schooling was extremely rare, mostly limited to wealthy boys destined for the church, learning Latin, or perhaps some sons of nobles who might learn reading, writing, and knightly skills from a tutor. Most rural children never even saw a book in their entire lives, let alone learn to read or write.
So their education was purely practical, learned by doing.
Entirely practical. Learned through constant labor, observation, imitation, and harsh correction. Not through formal instruction in anything resembling a classroom.
And discipline was harsh.
Incredibly harsh by our standards. A stark contrast to modern parenting ideals. Parents, masters, and village elders disciplined children brutally. Spanking, flogging with rods or switches, or even severe beatings were considered entirely normal and necessary for misbehavior, laziness, or poor performance at tasks.
It was seen as necessary, for their own good.
It was genuinely believed to be essential for breaking their will, instilling obedience, driving out foolishness, and toughening them up for the harsh realities of adult life. What we would clearly identify as child abuse today was often considered responsible parenting or necessary training back then.
Were holy objects used?
Sometimes, disturbingly, yes. There are accounts or recommendations suggesting objects like a scapula, shoulder blade, supposedly from St. Dominic, or even heavy fetters, shackles, might be used as holy tools for whipping or restraining children, adding a perverse religious sanction to the cruelty. The line between discipline and outright cruelty was often non-existent, tragically sanctioned by the prevailing beliefs and norms of the time.
And child mortality.
Yeah.
Shockingly high.
Shockingly, heartbreakingly high. We mentioned it before, but it bears repeating in this context. Roughly 20% of infants died within their first year of life, and perhaps about half of all children died before reaching the age of 16. In one detailed study of medieval English records, 19% of infants died by age 2 alone.
19% by age 2, that's almost 1 in 5.
Yes, the constant presence of death touched even the youngest lives, making survival itself a daily gamble, not a given.
What were the main killers of children?
Common killers were relentless infectious diseases that swept through communities. Measles, mumps, smallpox, chickenpox, whooping cough, diphtheria, scarlet fever, and most commonly dehydrating diarrheal diseases like dysentery, spread through contaminated water and food. For many families, losing up to half their children before they reached adulthood was a tragic but expected reality.
Graves filled with infants.
Cemeteries often contained rows upon rows of tiny infant and child skeletons, sometimes marked with simple crosses, a silent, poignant testament to the immense constant grief that must have permeated every family, every community. Surviving childhood was, for the vast majority, far more a matter of sheer luck and having a robust constitution than the norm. It truly was a perilous journey just to reach maturity.
The profound fragility of childhood, the constant gnawing threat of loss for parents and children alike, It adds a whole other layer of sadness and vulnerability to the everyday struggles we've been talking about. That underlying fear for your children's survival must have been immense.
Absolutely. And if they did survive, the transition to adulthood was swift and early. Boys would be considered full-fledged laborers doing adult work by age 14 or even earlier. And girls were expected to marry and start having children very soon after puberty, often by 14 or 15, sometimes even younger in arranged noble marriages.
Marrying at 12.
In the aristocracy, girls as young as 12, sometimes even younger, were legally wed off in arranged marriages, purely for political alliances, land consolidation, and producing heirs. Their consent was entirely irrelevant. Even among peasants, teenage girls were often given husbands by 14 or 15.
And starting pregnancy so young.
Early pregnancy, often immediately after marriage, combined with the immense dangers of childbirth we discussed, further risked these young women's already fragile lives. These young bodies were pushed to their physical limits far too early, often before they were fully grown themselves.
Any concept of child protection?
Effectively none by our standards. There were no child protection laws as we know them. A poor or orphan child might be bound out by the parish to a noble household or a craftsman as a servant or apprentice, essentially unpaid labor. Abuse, neglect, and overwork were common in such situations, with little recourse or protection for the exploited child.
And play. Was there time for play?
Playing was truly a luxury, not seen as an essential part of development. Maybe a crude wooden hoop to roll, a stick used as a pretend sword, a simple rag doll, if any toy at all. Noble boys, knights in training, might play at war games as part of their education, but most children spent any free time helping their families or practicing skills essential for adult life, like archery for boys or spinning for girls. Their childhood was a direct, relentless preparation for the harsh realities of adult work and survival.
And real dangers lurk too, not just imaginary monsters.
Monsters under the bed were hardly the main concern. Real wolves still prowled the edges of forests and villages in many parts of Europe, and bandits or hostile soldiers were genuine, terrifying threats, especially at night or when traveling. The fears of childhood were tangible and ever-present, lurking in the shadows just outside their poorly secured hovels. It's such a stark contrast to how we view childhood today, isn't it? The overwhelming weight of responsibility from such a young age, the constant fear of illness and death, the almost complete lack of true, carefree moments of play, learning, and exploration for its own sake.
The quiet absence of unburdened play, the incredibly early onset of labor and adult responsibility, the constant proximity to death and suffering. It's hard to reconcile with the joy and boundless potential we now associate with youth.
The feeling of profound vulnerability for children and parents alike was an ever-present hum in their lives, a constant underlying anxiety about the survival and well-being of their young ones in a world fraught with peril at every turn. Hashtag Tech10. Superstitions, weird beliefs, and daily fear.
Let's delve now into perhaps the stranger corners of the medieval mind. The world of daily fear, yes, but also the weird, sometimes baffling beliefs that colored every interaction with the world around them. It's a glimpse into a truly different way of thinking about cause, effect, and the forces governing their lives.
Right, because alongside the very real threats of disease, hunger, and violence, there was this whole other layer of perceived danger from the supernatural, the magical, the unseen. And everyone, from the lowliest peasant to the most educated scholar or priest, believed deeply in these things.
Like curses, the evil eye.
Absolutely. Curses, the malevolent power of the evil eye causing misfortune just by looking with envy, and the dark influence of witchcraft were accepted realities. If your cow suddenly stopped giving milk, or your butter wouldn't churn, or a crop failed unexpectedly, neighbors might immediately and seriously claim a local witch had cursed it. Misfortune wasn't seen as random chance or natural occurrence. It was often attributed to a specific, magical, malevolent hand at work.
So people used charms for protection.
Constantly. Amulets made of dried herbs known for protective qualities, like rowan or St. John's wort. Special stones, pieces of metal or scraps of parchment inscribed with prayers or magic symbols, were incredibly common. Worn constantly on the body, hung over doorways, or placed in barns to ward off demons, evil spirits, bad luck, and the evil eye.
And astrology played a huge role.
It dictated everything for those who could afford an astrologer. Wedding dates, the best time to start a journey or a business venture, the opportune moment to launch a battle. People genuinely believed that the alignment of stars and planets at the moment of birth determined your character and fate, and that celestial movements controlled earthly events.
What about eclipses? Comets?
Terrifying events. A solar eclipse might cause mass panic, with people genuinely believing the sun is dying, or that it was a dire omen foretelling plague, famine, or the death of a king. Comets were almost universally seen as harbingers of disaster.
And fortune tellers, village healers.
Fortune tellers, scryers, who gazed into crystals or water, and herbalists, often older women in the village. The wise women, or cunning folk, were both eagerly sought after for their supposed wisdom, healing remedies, love potions, and predictions, but also deeply feared for their potential connection to dark forces, to witchcraft. They held a very precarious, ambiguous position in society, seen as both potential healers and potential sources of evil.
And illness was still linked to the spiritual.
Deeply intertwined. For something as simple as a headache, a folk remedy might be to smear a crushed spider or its web on the brow. Madness, as we discussed, was almost universally seen as demonic possession, leading people to pray over the afflicted, sprinkle them with holy water, or tragically chain them in dungeons or subject them to brutal exorcisms, believing they were imprisoning or expelling evil itself.
And that belief about leprosy.
One particularly bizarre and dark folk belief, recorded in some places, claimed that sexual intercourse with a virgin could miraculously cure leprosy or other diseases like syphilis. Incredibly, desperately ill people sometimes truly tried this, leading to horrific acts of exploitation and assault, born from utter desperation and a complete misunderstanding of contagion. It's a profound, dark example of how desperate belief could override basic morality and lead to further suffering.
And animals on trial. That really happened.
Yes, in a truly astonishing example of their worldview, animals were sometimes criminally charged and literally put on trial in medieval courts, both secular and ecclesiastical. Pigs, horses, dogs, rats, even insects like locusts or weevils were brought before judges.
How could they hold a trial for a pig?
With surprising formality. They might appoint lawyers for the animal defendant and the prosecution. Witnesses would testify. Judgments were passed. We mentioned the pig in 1226 burned alive for devouring a child, and the pig in Fleas in 1386 that killed a baby. It had its snout and forelegs mutilated, just like a human criminal might be punished, before being dressed in human clothes and publicly hanged.
Treating the animal with the same legal gravity, the same punitive intent as a human perpetrator. It reflects a profound blurring of lines between the human and animal worlds and a belief in animal culpability.
Exactly. And pests like worms or caterpillars that plagued crops weren't just endured. They were sometimes formally exorcised from fields by priests, commanded in the name of God to leave. Fools, or those with intellectual disabilities, were sometimes fitted into a donkey costume and paraded through town for public humiliation, a cruel spectacle of mockery called the Asinaria. This was a world of strange punishments and ritualistic justice for both humans and animals, deeply rooted in these unusual beliefs.
Even objects or corpses could be tried.
The church sometimes held trials for inanimate objects deemed cursed, or, more commonly, for corpses. We mentioned the Cadaver Synod in 897, where Pope Stephen VI had the 9-month dead body of his predecessor, Pope Formosus, exhumed, dressed in papal vestments, propped up on a throne, and put on trial for perjury and other crimes.
They put a corpse on trial.
Yes, he was found guilty, stripped of his vestments, his fingers of blessing cut off, and his body thrown into the Tiber River. It was an extreme example, but it shows how even the dead could be held accountable in their legal and religious systems. This was all part of a world profoundly governed by intense, often illogical superstition, where the dead, animals, and even objects could be caught up in human dramas of guilt and punishment. It's a world where the bizarre and the terrifying were completely, inextricably intertwined with the everyday. The very air felt charged with unseen forces, where every rustle of leaves, every shadow, every coincidence held a potential hidden meaning, often a threatening one.
So daily life was infused with fear based on the supernatural.
Constantly. A bad dream wasn't just your subconscious. It could be interpreted as demons meddling with your soul or foretelling disaster. Every small, unexplained event could be an omen.
Unlucky numbers. Black cats.
Unlucky numbers, like 13, were genuinely feared. Black cats crossing your path could spook even the most outwardly rational individuals. Spilling salt required throwing a pinch over your left shoulder to ward off the devil. Mental illness, like profound depression or epilepsy, was routinely blamed on demonic influence or possession. Priests would beat or starve the possessed into confessions or apparent cures, believing they were driving out evil. It was a world where everything was a possible evil sign, maintaining a constant pervasive atmosphere of anxiety and dread about unseen forces.
The sheer mental burden of living in a world where everything could be a sign, where every shadow held a potential supernatural threat. It must have been absolutely exhausting, a constant vigilance against forces you couldn't see or understand.
It must have been. The quiet murmurs of village gossip so easily twisting into chilling accusations of witchcraft, the terror of believing you're cursed by a neighbor and that your life is spiraling out of your control because of magic. It's a deep existential dread that feels almost palpable when you read the accounts.
And the way animals were brought into this human drama of justice and punishment, it paints a truly surreal, almost dreamlike picture of their worldview, so fundamentally different from our own rational frameworks today. Hashtag Malevin. Nobles and royalty weren't that lucky either.
Now, after hearing about all the hardships faced by peasants and commoners, you might naturally think that being wealthy, a noble, or even royalty would offer a complete escape from the harsh realities of medieval life. But the truth is more complicated. Even at the very top, life held its own unique and often brutal challenges, proving that wealth and status couldn't buy true safety or happiness. It was often just a different kind of gilded cage.
Right, so being rich spared you from hunger, maybe the worst of the filth, but not from everything else.
Exactly. It didn't spare you from cruelty, danger, disease, or political machinations. For instance, royals and high nobles spent their lives entangled in arranged marriages. These weren't based on love or personal choice. They were purely strategic moves for forging alliances, consolidating land, and ensuring political stability. Women especially had absolutely no say in who their partners would be.
Sent off to marry a stranger for political reasons.
Precisely. And while these marriages were designed to produce heirs, infidelity was absolutely rampant in many courts, an open secret. Husbands or wives could be, and sometimes were, quietly disposed of poisoned, accidentally killed, if they became politically inconvenient or failed to produce the necessary heir.
So court life was dangerous, full of plots.
Extremely dangerous. Scandals or even simple traitorous whispers and rumors at court could easily result in swift accusations, imprisonment, poisonings, or public executions. Kings and powerful lords were constantly paranoid, always looking over their shoulders for rivals, even within their own families.
Employing spies, assassins.
Often, yes. Employing networks of spies or loyal knights to monitor or even murder rivals was commonplace. Poison, meticulously crafted from herbal toxins like nightshade or aconite, or insidious mineral poisons like arsenic or mercury, was a feared and often used tool at court, making every meal, every shared cup of wine, a potential threat to life itself. Trust was a rare and dangerous commodity.
So rulers often met violent ends.
Many did. Several Byzantine emperors, for instance, were famously stabbed, strangled, or suffocated in their own palaces. English kings faced rebellions and assassinations. Simply being near the feet of power meant having a constant target painted on your back, as the pursuit of power was often a brutal, zero-sum, fatal game.
And their richer diet caused problems too.
Yes, their higher social class often meant that richer diet we discussed, and also often more opportunities for multiple sexual partners, which led to their own unique set of diseases. Nobles frequently suffered from the excruciating gout of kings due to their excessive consumption of red meat, rich sauces, and alcohol. Privilege, ironically, brought its own specific maladies of excess.
And sexually transmitted diseases, like syphilis.
They caught syphilis and other emerging STDs as soon as these horrific diseases appeared in Europe. These affected even powerful figures like popes, kings, and cardinals, sometimes leading to insanity, paralysis, and disfiguring physical decay in their later years.
And heirs often died from inbreeding.
Heirs often died young from childhood diseases, just like commoners, but also repeated inbreeding within small royal and noble circles, aimed at keeping bloodlines pure and consolidating power, sometimes caused genetic weakness, infertility, hemophilia, the royal disease, and unusual physical or mental disorders in some prominent royal families, crippling dynasties from within.
It really was a golden cage then. All the wealth, all the power, all the privilege in the world couldn't buy freedom from physical pain, debilitating illness, sudden violent ends, or genetic misfortune.
Absolutely. Even royal children weren't vaccinated, of course. Childhood illnesses like smallpox or measles killed princes and princesses just as easily as peasant children, ruining carefully constructed dynastic plans and succession lines. Rulers themselves could go apparently insane from unknown causes, perhaps lead poisoning, perhaps syphilis, perhaps genetic factors, perhaps stress, like King Henry VI of England, whose recurring bouts of madness plunged his kingdom into the chaos of the Wars of the Roses. The mind, even a royal mind, was vulnerable to unseen forces and inexplicable torments.
And if a king got sick, did doctors treat them better?
If a king got sick with terrifying symptoms like vomiting blood, severe abdominal pain, or persistent ulcers, The royal physicians were often just as clueless as they were for peasants, despite their fine clothes and academic titles. They might try bleeding or purging, just like with commoners, often with equally disastrous results.
So kings died from mundane things too, like hemorrhoids.
Some are said to have died from ruptured ulcers, or complications of severe hemorrhoids, or infections following minor surgery. Mundane, but deadly conditions that modern medicine easily handles.
And King Henry III in the lampreys, is that true?
King Henry III of England was rumored, famously, to have died from acute indigestion, a surfeit of lampreys, after gorging himself on a dish of these rich, eel-like fish against his doctor's advice. Another king, Louis the Fat of France, allegedly died from complications related to his obesity. These anecdotal tales, whether entirely accurate or not, highlight that even the most powerful often fell victim to very ordinary, sometimes embarrassing problems which were poorly understood and largely untreatable.
So nobility meant status and luxury, but definitely not safety or a guaranteed long life.
Not at all. Many died young from hunting accidents, fevers, infections, childbirth complications for noble women, or became entangled in deadly royal feuds and political plots, dying just as tragically, sometimes even more brutally than commoners. The great equalizer ultimately was disease, violence, and death itself.
It's a strange kind of equalizer, isn't it? That profound understanding that no amount of wealth or power, no matter how vast, could truly shield you from the harsh, undeniable realities of the human body, the randomness of fate, and the ever-present threat of betrayal and violence, even from within your own glittering court.
The profound isolation that must have come with power. Always watching your back, always suspecting plots, even among your closest family and advisors.
Yeah.
It feels very lonely and terrifying. A constant state of hypervigilance where trust could be fatal.
And the quiet, relentless suffering of an illness that no one could explain or cure, even with the finest doctors and all the resources of a kingdom at your side. That kind of helplessness must have been uniquely agonizing, maybe even terrifying, for those accustomed to wielding ultimate power and control over everything else. #tag 12. The 10 most insane real-life things that actually happened.
Okay, to wrap things up, let's maybe touch on some of the most genuinely astonishing, often horrifying, and frankly, utterly bizarre real-life incidents and beliefs from the medieval period. These are the moments where history feels truly unbelievable, almost like dark fiction, revealing a mindset so profoundly different from our own.
Right, the kind of things that make you say, did that really happen?
Exactly. First, let's revisit those animal trials. We mentioned them, but the sheer formality is astounding. Animals literally faced medieval courts, accused of crimes.
Like the pig that ate a child.
Yes, in 1226, that pig was formally tried, found guilty, and publicly burned alive. And the pig in Fleas, Normandy in 1386, that killed a baby. It had its face mutilated, dressed in human clothes, and hanged in the public square. The legal system treated it as a culpable murderer.
And pests, too. Rats, insects.
Yes. Pests like rats, locusts, or caterpillars that damage crops could even be tried in absentia in church courts. Sometimes this led to priests performing formal exorcisms to banish them or issuing rulings condemning them. Medieval justice was so fundamentally different, it extended concepts of criminal guilt and legal process to the animal kingdom, and sometimes even to inanimate objects thought to be cursed.
Okay, number 2.
The chilling possibility of Wicker Man sacrifices. While often associated with more ancient Celtic druids, Roman writers, notably Julius Caesar recounting his campaigns in Gaul, describe the druids burning people alive inside giant, woven wooden effigies shaped like humans.
Turning people inside.
Yes. Caesar detailed these huge wicker statues filled with living men, then set ablaze as a sacrifice to the gods. He claimed criminals were the primary victims, but also implied that if there weren't enough criminals, innocents could be burned instead. Whether entirely accurate or Roman propaganda, it symbolizes the shocking ritualistic brutality some pre-Christian or pagan practices might have held. A truly terrifying image of immolation on a grand scale.
Third, the reality of cannibalism during famines. We discussed the Great Famine, 1315-17, but the accounts are worth repeating for their sheer horror. When starvation reached its absolute peak, people literally ate each other, families eating corpses, or worse.
Chronicles explicitly describe families consuming corpses found in the streets, digging up fresh graves, or even, in the most extreme, heart-wrenching accounts, killing infants or neighbors for food. And it's not just stories. Archaeological digs and sites associated with extreme poverty or famine have found human bones with distinct cut marks, butcher marks, providing irrefutable physical proof of desperate, real-world cannibalism born of unimaginable starvation. It represents the ultimate taboo broken by the ultimate desperation.
Fourth, and maybe even weirder in some ways, eating dead bodies as medicine. We touched on this, but medieval and early modern Europe widely practiced medical cannibalism. Doctors, apothecaries, and patients genuinely believed human remains held potent curative properties. Mummy powder.
Yes, Egyptian mummies were imported in huge quantities, ground into powder, and sold in apothecaries as a standard remedy to stop bleeding, cure bruises, or treat various internal ailments.
The fresh bodies, too.
Yes. Doctors prescribed remedies made from human skulls, often moss-covered skulls called usnea, believing the powder cured headaches or epilepsy. Human fat was rendered down and used as an ointment for wounds or aching joints. That 17th century tincture, King's Drops, contained distilled human skull and was hugely popular for treating seizures or apoplexy. Executioners even commonly sold the still warm blood of the freshly hanged or beheaded to onlookers who drank it as a cure for epilepsy.
Drinking blood from an executioner.
Considered a potent cure. This grim practice was seen as scientific at the time, based on ideas of like cures like or transferring a vital spirit, and it was used by nobles, priests, and commoners alike, highlighting a profound, widespread societal delusion that lasted for centuries.
It's just the sheer strangeness of some of these practices.
Yeah.
The way common sense and basic human revulsion seem to entirely evaporate under extreme circumstances or deeply ingrained, bizarre beliefs. It's genuinely hard to process how these things could have been considered normal, let alone medicinal.
Yeah, fifth, public floggings for sinful acts. Acts we would now consider private matters, personal sins, or even perfectly normal human functions were often punished publicly and brutally. People were scourged, whipped in town squares.
For what kind of things?
For perceived sexual transgressions like homosexuality, adultery, sometimes even masturbation if discovered, or for blasphemy, public drunkenness, or just having supposedly sinful thoughts that priests claimed to discern or that were revealed in confession and deemed worthy of public penance. The human body was made a site for public morality lessons, laid bare for judgment and shame.
There are records of this.
Oh yes, records of men being whipped for urinating publicly in a disrespectful place, or monks being disciplined for masturbation. Women caught in adultery were sometimes paraded nude through the streets and then flogged. Such punishments were explicitly meant to shame the sinner into repentance, not just for earthly crimes, but for eternity-bound offenses. The public humiliation was a core, devastating part of the punishment, intended to scar both body and soul. Sixth, corpse marriages and desecrations. The Church's intense focus on marriage, property, and the sanctity or lack thereof of the dead led to some truly ghastly rituals and legal proceedings. Corpse marriages. In some rare canon law cases, primarily concerning property disputes or legitimacy of heirs, a widow might theoretically be forced to undergo a ceremony marrying her dead husband's corpse or remains, a practice sometimes called marriage by ossuary, specifically to legally solidify inheritance or keep property within the family line. It's an almost gothic horror, made horrifyingly real by the complexities of medieval law and lineage.
And desecrating corpses, or trying them.
More commonly, horrifying. We mentioned the cadaver synod, where a dead pope was put on trial. And sometimes, when a homicide occurred, the corpse of the victim might be brought into court during the trial of the accused, perhaps in the belief that the wounds might miraculously bleed again in the presence of the murderer. Cruentation. Grave goods and burial rituals were sacred, yet grave robbing or disturbing a tomb could lead to accusations of witchcraft, curses, or even execution. The sanctity of the dead existed alongside their potential use in legal proceedings, a strange, unsettling paradox.
Seventh, those unusual royal deaths. We touched on them, but monarchs sometimes died in truly peculiar, often undignified ways that became legendary.
Right, King Henry VI of England supposedly perishing from that surfeit of lampreys. King Louis XIII of France is said to have died from complications of Crohn's disease, possibly a burst ulcer or severe intestinal issues, maybe exacerbated by physicians' purges. King George II of Great Britain, much later, but still fitting the pattern, died falling off his toilet.
Botched enemas, exploding bladder stones.
There are tales, often embellished, of kings dying from such things. Whether strictly true or not, these stories highlight the vulnerability of even the most powerful to mundane accidents, or poorly understood medical conditions. On the flip side, commoners might blame a plague outbreak or famine on a king's sin or a failed royal ritual, sometimes even accusing unpopular leaders of causing disasters through divine displeasure or hidden crimes. The personal fate and perceived virtue of the king were often seen as inextricably tied to the well-being and divine favor of the entire realm.
8. The sheer breadth of insane folk beliefs. Some common beliefs truly defy belief from our perspective.
People widely thought that if a vampire bit you, only specific rituals, sometimes involving feeding the vampire wine or more blood, could save you. They firmly believed in werewolves as a real phenomenon, that gout could be caused by eating cursed pies, or that Lilith, a demon from Jewish folklore, literally stole babies in the night. The supernatural wasn't abstract. It was a very real, terrifying part of daily reality, explaining misfortune and danger.
Leech curses, spiders for luck.
Some folk healers attempted leech-based curse removal ceremonies. People carried spiders dried in pouches for good luck or protection. Every unexplained phenomenon, every shadow, every coincidence was potentially attributed to unseen, often malevolent forces. These superstitions kept everyone, to some degree, in fear of the unknown world around them.
Ninth, the horror of massacres by religious mobs. Entire communities could be wiped out based on rumor, fear, and religious hatred.
During outbursts of witch panic, or during the Crusades, both against Muslims abroad and heretics within Europe, hundreds, sometimes thousands, of innocents could be slaughtered indiscriminately by inflamed mobs or zealous armies. We mentioned Béziers in 1209, where Crusaders murdered nearly the whole population under the order "kill them all." Similar massacres happened against Jewish communities during the First Crusade and the Black Death, blaming them for society's ills. The fervor of faith, when twisted by fear and hatred, could lead to horrific, indiscriminate violence on a scale that truly defies belief.
And finally, just a grab bag of other nightmarish oddities.
People believed truly wild tales, often recorded in medical or folk texts, that menstrual blood could cure rabies, that powdered mummy brains stopped epilepsy, that sex with a virgin cured venereal disease, a tragically persistent and dangerous myth, or that the urine of a pure virgin could heal blindness, leading to desperate, disgusting attempts to test such claims, likely causing further harm and exploitation. Religious relics were routinely sold as cures for anything and everything: a splinter of the true cross for fever, a saint's finger bone supposedly curing childlessness. It was a world saturated with desperate hope, seeking cures in the bizarre, the macabre, and the fundamentally illogical. It really is like wandering through a surreal, often terrifying dreamscape, isn't it? So many things that utterly defy logic and our modern understanding of the world, yet were completely normal, accepted, and profoundly real for the people living then. The sheer volume of strange, sometimes terrifying, and often heartbreaking stories and beliefs we've just touched upon. It feels like stepping into a different universe entirely, one operating on completely different principles of reality. It absolutely makes you appreciate, perhaps more deeply than ever before, how much has profoundly shifted over the centuries. Not just in our technology and medicine, but in the very fabric of how we understand the world, our bodies, causality, justice, and our place within the cosmos. It's a stark reminder of how different the past truly was.
That's all for now. We've come to the end of our gentle little story for tonight.
And if you're still here, that's perfectly okay.
Sometimes your mind just needs a little more space to wander, and that's a tender, beautiful thing.
You don't have to rush off to sleep.
Just be here, however you are.
You deserve quiet moments like this.
You deserve to rest, to be held by stillness.
There's no pressure, no expectations, just soft breathing, gentle thoughts, and the hush of night.
The world is a softer place with you in it.
Good night, truly.
Just listen to the rain sounds now.